all look very nice today. Thank you for remembering to dress up for the picture. So I don't have any announcements or anything. So I'm going to have Liz talk about what she'll be doing for photo day.
Hi. So we're just, I'm going to move my equipment in there because over there the light bulbs like reflect back the light too much. So I'm going to go in there. So I have a list and just put your, like I have your name, next to your name, put your email where you want me to send that headshot. It's like nothing crazy, just like from here. But yeah, I can send you like multiple ones. You guys know. That's all I have.
All right then. Time for some React. Okay. So today we're going to go over kind of like a recap of the different types of ways you can manage state in your applications. And I was trying to think of the best way to do this, other than just typing them all out again. But it'd probably be helpful if we did that, at least real quick. We don't have to spend an exorbitant amount of time like into all the nitty gritties, but just so you have an idea of what you think would be useful for your project. All right, so there's, oh, I did have some Visio diagrams of some of the things that we were talking about. So this represents the location and what components have access to state depending on where it lives, right? So the state that's up in here is inside the app component. It's available throughout the entire application because it's data flow from top down. Whereas this state down here can only go from this view B down to these text nodes down here. It can't travel back up, right? So if you're going to use just regular use state or use reducer, just keep that in mind that you can only pass data down, can't pass it back up. And the other one was a diagram related to that quick store component library. So you have your application inside, you have your store, which wraps all of your components inside. So here's your state. Every time state changes, it re-renders the application so that the new data shows up in your app. Inside your UI elements, whether they're buttons or whatever, there's an action that can be dispatched. These are what actions look like. They go back to the store and the cycle continues. So it's just as a little visual as a reminder of what that data flow looks like. Let's see. So the first method we talked about was just plain old use state. And let's go back to close App Store, we'll close inventory. And I think for now, we'll just use the header component, just like we were before. So right now, there really isn't much in here. There is the store, so we do have that. So I'm going to take that out, or just comment it out. And this just becomes, I'm going to do this. So if this doesn't work, it'll default to something. I'll just keep it out. Never mind. I don't want to introduce too much new stuff here. All right, so we've got that. Got a button. We'll just comment that out. Oh, that's not going to work. And then I'll run the app. No. Oh, it is running. Start it over. Did everyone? I did see a couple of notes from students where they sent me or sent to the Slack chat, kind of like how their application is structured or the idea behind the structure. Did everyone, think about how maybe they'd want to, if they're going to use React? First of all, just show of hands, who's deciding that they want to use React for any part of the application? So we got, okay, so most. All right, is there a particular state management solution that appealed to you based on what we talked about yesterday?
I definitely need something, I think, that
they put something in, it's gonna send it back.
So more like the store type of
I think
approach?
so, yeah. For me.
Because you have a lot of nested type component structures and a lot of routes, right?
Me too.
You too? Okay. All right. So does anyone think that a simple use state or use reducer will be enough for what they plan on doing for their capstone? Start there, that's good. And see if you need to, if it becomes too painful, and you're like, oh my gosh, I need a store, I need something else. Okay. All right, so we'll go over each one of these. Okay, nothing's breaking, so that's good. All right, so we'll start with a simple use state. So we're already importing it. And this first type of state management is literally just defining a piece of state. We'll just say the brand, set brand. Right. And if we want to pass this, oh, we're already in our header. So we're already managing our state inside this component because that's where it lives. So we could just say, hey, this is going to be our brand. If I save that, look at my app, you can see I have that initial state right there. I can go create a way to change that state. And I'm going to give this button a click event. And all we're going to do is we're going to call this second updater function to change our piece of state. Is everyone comfortable with this this use state hook? Does it make sense for everyone at this point? Right, so the first variable you define in this array, use state always gives you an array, two things. First one is the value that you're storing in that piece of state. And the second is a function to change it. Whatever you pass in there, it's going to change it. So it doesn't have to be a string. I could pass something else in, like 1, 2, 3, and it'll render that. However, if I pass something that my component or my element is not expecting to render, let's say an object, I have to be careful of the type of data I'm storing in that piece of state. So if I were to change this, that's not going to work, right? Because React doesn't know how to render an object to the screen. But if I were to say brand, it's an object, so it would be brand.brand. That works, right? Because I know what I'm expecting. So just be careful of the type of data you're storing in these pieces of state. That way it's, you're going to render what you're supposed to be rendering. So back to normal. All right, so that's use state. Use reducer comes into play when your piece of, let's say you have, let's do this. Let's say you have all these use states and you have one for each piece of state. And you're like, okay, this is cool. I got one for each state. But this might become painful to use too. You can totally do this, right? But if you have 28 pieces of state all in the same component, why not lump them into one object? Now you could use just regular use state, but if you remember from before, every time you pass in that new piece of state, you have to manage all the previous properties of that piece of state. Now that's not too difficult because you can just say, set brand, then you have that object and you say ... brand, and then the new stuff. But that kind of gets old, especially if you're passing props down to other components. That can get real confusing really fast. And so the second one we went over was use reducer. And the use reducer is just a pattern that's been around for a while, where you determine which part of state you want to be changed. You're very explicit about which part is going to have the change applied to it, if at all. If an act, and this is where you like dispatch that action. You say action of this type, change this thing. Or if you pass an action it's not looking for, it can't find, then it just has some sort of default behavior. Either you return the state or you throw an error and you say, nope, sorry, that's illegal, you can't do that. So to use reducer, you create a reducer function. Well, first of all, you create your initial state. So we'll say const initial state, and we'll just say brand initial brand. And what did we do before? Like inventory link, initial link. We have this piece of state that we're going to have as our default data. Then when we create that reducer function, and who remembers what reducer takes for its arguments? It's the first, it takes 2 arguments. What's the first one? State. Right. Called the action. And then what's the norm we were using yesterday and the day before to change state, or to act upon this action? Yep. And what are we going to switch on? Action.type. We need to know which type of action we're taking, right? Always start with your default, so you don't forget it. The default for this pattern is typically to return state. If no changes are to be made, just return it as it is, right? No changes done. Or you can throw an error. I've seen it both ways. Then we just give a case statement. We could say update brand. I'm spelling update correctly today. I haven't mistyped it once. We'll see if that continues. And then what do we return in this case statement? Right, so the thing we're going to return eventually is our state, right? The state of our data. Yep, so we want to return all the previous properties of state. And remember, the last thing in wins, right? So we want to overwrite the thing we want to change. So in this case, it would be the brand. And what are we changing it to? There's something else we pass in with that action. Payload. Sometimes it's just one character to remember it, right? All right. So when we dispatch an action to this thing, we expect there will be a type property on it and a payload. But if you remember from other patterns, you don't necessarily have to have a payload, but you need a type. You need to know how to act upon this change, that you want to have happen. I'll actually show one more example of a typical scenario where it's kind of trivial, but it really explains why sometimes you don't need a particular payload. But let's just change this thing first. So on click, we need to use our reducer. So we're going to comment out this one. We will say const, and then we get our app state and dispatch. That's comes from use reducer. And first thing we pass it is our reducer. The next thing we pass it is, anyone? Give you a hint, it's on the screen. You can cheat. Our initial state, right? It needs to know what our starting point is so that it can use that as all the previous, the previous form of state. So every time we take an action, we say, oh, all those previous properties, we got to know what they are. So you have to pass something in. It could be an empty object or array or whatever that type of data you have. Here we just defined this simple object up here. And then this would no longer be brand. It would be appstate.brand. And this is where we dispatch. right? We dispatch an action, it has a type. We want to update that brand. We want to give it a payload. I'm just going to say byte. If I can spell that. We're doing the exact same thing as before, right? But now we can be very explicit about what's going to change in our state and where we're making that change from. So that one example that I was talking about, a type, but no payload. So we'll do this here. We'll say, instead of brand, we'll say counter. And instead of, we'll say increment counter, we'll just say inc as an increment, or just increment, that makes sense. We'll say increment. I'm missing, there we go. And we'll do one for decrement. This is the classic example in like even the Redux examples. So we need a case statement for each one. First of all, we need a counter because we're expecting something in state called counter. We'll start that at 0. When we listen for an action type of increment, we'll say we return all of our previous state. The counter is going to be state.counter plus action.payload. State.counter because that's the previous value, because reducer passes the previous state in as part of that function. And then we could just increment that by whatever we're passing in with the payload. Or it's actually, we're not passing in a payload. We're just saying +1. Or +5 or +5 million. Whatever you're counting. And then we could do the same for decrement, right? Because we don't have a payload this time. We just want to say, hey, do this thing. And now when we, right? So you don't need a payload, but you do need a type. So between use state and use reducer, do these make sense? Are there any questions on these? These were the simple ones, right? Of all the things in React and state management, this is the simplest way to do state management, but it's totally valid. Like just because it's simple doesn't mean it's not right. There's no one right way to do things, except for syntax. You got to get your syntax right. Keywords as well. Everything else is up for grabs. Okay. See what was the two other types of state management that we were talking about? Anyone remember? Context. After context, it's some sort of component state management library, right? Whether it's Quickstore or Redux or a handful of others. So when use state becomes painful, you would move to something like use reducer, right? And when that becomes too cumbersome, then you start to look at context, right? Especially if you're passing data down like a massive component tree, right? Because you have to keep passing props down to each component, to each component, to each component. That gets really tiring after a while. It gets confusing, especially if something's misnamed along the way. Been there, done that. You could say I can't even type byte tonight. So imagine me passing a variable down between 20 layers of components. It's just, it's not going to happen easily. So context is our friend when we have more complex application structures. And to do that, we'll create We already have this context store. We'll just do this the simplest form of context for now. And we'll just say, we'll just put it in stores because it's kind of like a store. We'll just say context.js. And to use context, we need to import some stuff from React. We need to import React itself. We need something called create context. And then we also need something called use context. First thing we do is we create this context that we want to have hold our state. So I'll just say app context equals create context. And I'm going to give it an initial value. It doesn't have to be the first value that we're going to use in our application. It just needs to be something that represents the shape of our state. What is this state going to be? In fact, we'll start with just, oh, hold on, from React. I was wondering why that was yelling at me. We'll just start with something, we'll start with a theme color. In fact, we'll call this theme context. Because right now our theme of our header is the dark theme, and there is a light theme. So we can, if we want to switch between the two, we can have our context manage what's the current value. Is it supposed to be light or dark? The next thing we'll need is a provider. Context has the concept of a provider and a consumer. Does everyone remember that from last night? Okay. So to get our provider, well, first of all, we need a component that's going to act as the provider that will wrap around the parts of our application that we want to have state available to. And we'll just call this theme provider. We'll return theme context dot provider. That's provided to us with our context. What else do we need to do in here? If we're going to wrap around our entire app, what do we need? Children. That's available on props. So it's going to reformat for me because it knows better than I do. All right, so now we have our context. We have our theme provider. The next thing we need to do is we need a way to consume this data. So we'll create a function called use theme context. And that's going to return use context. We're going to invoke use context and pass in the context object. Oh, sorry. I'm like so into this. So we need to tell use context which context to use, right? So we'll pass in the theme context that we created. And that'll allow us to consume the data from our provider. The other thing that provider needs is a value. It doesn't know what to provide if we don't give it to it. So in this case, well, right now it's defaulting to dark. So the value would be just dark. So now we can go into our app.js. We're going to get rid of App Store. We're going to import theme provider from stores, not context store, just context. We should have called that theme context.js. That's okay. We'll wrap our entire application in it. Actually, technically, let's do this. Because we're only going to use this inside of header, all we need to do is wrap header. That's the only part of this application that it cares about.
Can you break this
Oh, yeah, sorry, I have my glasses
No
on.
worries, no worries.
We'll take a break at 6:30. All right. I'm so subtle. Sorry. All right. So because header's the only place that cares about this theme data, that's the only thing we need to wrap in it. The rest of our application doesn't care. And that's what's nice about context, is you get to choose where that context is valid. You can wrap your entire application if you're going to use it as like a store, or you can just wrap one particular component that just needs access to a bunch of data. And any of the children inside of header will also have access to it because it's down that lineage, I guess you want to call it, your component tree lineage. All right, so inside our header, we need to import that consumer function. So we're going to import use, what do we call it? Use theme context from stores context. Autocomplete is too fast for me. And let's see, right now we'll get rid of that counter. We'll keep one button. We'll just have it called toggle theme. I'm not going to dispatch anything right now. It's going to be empty function just to make our application happy. We'll set this back to the text byte. And here we have color. Okay, so this is the part we're going to change. We're going to get rid of, comment that out. And then we'll say const theme equals use theme context. So the value of theme is whatever we're consuming from our provider, which in this case, it's just a string that says dark. So if we go down to here in color, we could just say theme. Now this is just a prop that we give to navbar. We can either give it dark or light. And so we can't just really throw theme on top of it. We have to decide how we want to render this prop. And an easy way to do that is we can say dark equals theme equals dark, and light equals theme equals light. That's the quickest way to do that. So this will be true if theme is dark. This will be true if theme is light. Only one of those is going to win. But the color is set to the theme. We don't have to switch on that or do the conditional strat. It's just a string that's going to come in. Does that make sense? So using conditional statements, whether or not to pass this prop in is true or false, that's how you would do that. There's a couple other ways that you can handle that, but this is by far the simplest way to do it. All right, so let's go over to our app. And we are not exporting. Whoops. Let's export those. Now everything's happy. So it's dark right now. This button doesn't do anything yet. So if I were to change value to light, now I have the light theme. So that data passed from my provider to that consumer function, and then I use that variable inside of my component. Did everyone see the flow of that? Do you want me to go over it again? Good. Okay. So we'll set this to dark. There's one more step of this I want to do, but not until we get this part. So the first thing we do is we import our create context and use context. Those are the two things to make this whole pattern happen. We create a context using this function and pass it some sort of initial value. Like this doesn't have to say dark, it could just be an empty string, just something so that you as a developer know that when you get back to setting this value, you know what type it should be. Like if you're creating an object of things, here's your property 1, and that's an object, and property 2 might be an array. Just make sure that the basic structure of whatever this value is, just put that in here. It's just a reminder to yourself. It'll get overwritten when you put the value in anyway. So this is just to say, hey, this context is just a string. That's all it is. Then we create a function to create a consumer of the data using the useContext hook. And the reason that we're exporting a function that returns this is because we can't actually use a hook outside of a function component. So we're not really using this at all right now. All we're doing is we're saying, hey, this particular function here, whenever it's called, it's going to return the execution of this one. And that pattern is very important because when I'm in here, this function will never be called because nothing's calling this one, right? It's just kind of dormant, right? It's going to return the result of this function being executed. Whereas in header, that's where I'm actually calling this function. And so it's totally legal for me to actually use context in this particular place because this is where it's being invoked, not back in the other file. So that's kind of an important distinction. You're going to see that pattern a lot in JavaScript where instead of just calling a function right away, you return another function that will be called, right? So there's a lot of libraries that do that. So it's kind of nice to be able to see this pattern up front, especially in this particular example is useful to us right now, right? We want to be able to consume this data. Well, in order to do that, we have to use this particular pattern. So it has its own context in how we're using it right now. This is a great example of why this particular pattern works, why you would want to return another function being called. It's because this is the place that it's actually being invoked, not over in the other file. Does that make sense? Was I rambling too much? Okay. Functions can be passed around just like any other value. So you can also return them and return functions and inside of functions, inside of other functions. It can get pretty crazy, but just know that a function is just a value that you can pass around, and that's what makes this sort of pattern totally legit. All right. So we have our theme. So when we call this use theme context, we get back whatever data that we're consuming. And that data comes from our provider. So here all we did was create a component, a function component. We're returning this particular element here, this theme context.provider. We're passing it a value that we wanted to provide to our consumers. And we want to be able to render any children inside of this provider so that they have access to this consumer. So we defined in our app, we used our theme provider and we wrapped the header component. And now that this has down that component tree from our provider, we can use our consumer, and this will actually receive a value that provider is giving to us. Then all we have to do is just use it. In order to update it, we'd have to do something like we did before where we had that store that we set up, that context store. So in this case, it's no longer going to be a simple string. We're going to have our theme. That'll be a string. And then we'll have something, we could call it dispatch, but it's not really dispatch. We'll call it toggle theme. and that's just a function. This is just a placeholder function. It's called a no-op. It doesn't do anything. There's no operation being done. But it's just a reminder to say, hey, this thing, this is going to be a function at some point. All right, so now in here, we can bring back our old friend useState. And inside this provider function, we'll give our child consumer components a way to toggle this theme from light to dark. We'll just say const theme equals, I'm sorry, theme and set theme equals useState. This will be our default here. We'll start it off as dark. And then we'll say function toggle theme. When we call this function, its only purpose is to change the theme. So it'll say set theme. And it's going to say if the theme is dark, we'll set it to light. Otherwise, set it to dark. So if the theme is not equal to dark, it must be light. So change it back to dark. That's the only thing this function does. Now our value can no longer be just a string anymore, right? Our value has to look like this up here. So our value is now this object where theme is set to theme right here. And toggle theme is set to, well, toggle theme, this function here. So this object's being passed down to our consumers. Everyone follow so far? Okay, so we're just passing in an object as our value. Now our consumer, this isn't really theme anymore. We'll just call this value. So here we would say value.theme. Remember, because it's an object, so it's got a property of theme on it. If we want to toggle it, we would say value.toggle theme. So it'll call that function that all it's going to do is make that flip between light and dark. You can call this the Jedi app. And so now all it's doing is it's changing that one string value. We'll go back to Vader. All right. Questions on this? Was that easy to follow? It's kind of a simplification of yesterday. Was it easier to follow with just the string and the one toggle thing? Okay. Over here, good? All right, so instead of typing out this whole context store again, we'll just go over it. So it's essentially what we're doing in context, right? Where our value is this object, and we have a theme and some sort of way to change that theme. The context store from yesterday was we had this initial state, and instead of using useState, we utilized useReducer. So that theme and set theme are now our app state and our dispatch. So we call dispatch to send an action that has a type or a payload, and now we can act on that up here. It's the same thing except it's just a different value, right? So instead of providing it a simple string, we're providing it some state and a dispatcher that's going to call a useReducer. That's really the only difference. It's just, it looks more complex simply because there's just a different pattern, but it's still the context pattern. Does this still make sense from yesterday, or do we want to go through this one? Going through it? Okay. So let's just re-implement this. We already have, so this is our store. Same things up here, create context, use context, except now it's use reducer. We're calling this byte context. Just get me re-familiar with what this was as well. And then we're creating this use context store the same way that we're calling use theme context. Same thing, just different name. And we're creating a consumer, and then we're returning that consumer. This is the same thing as doing this. Now we're exactly the same. Use context, use context. Before I was just saving it to a variable and then returning it, but you could just return it. You don't have to save it to a variable. That pattern's nice if you want to debug it before it gets returned. Like put a breakpoint there or something. That way you know before it returns, you know what's the value you're expecting. That's just a debugging tool or debugging pattern. Did was that gone over in the testing, breakpoints and things like that? I don't know if that. Okay. Okay. Well, I don't know if. So I'm used to breakpoints in Visual Studio. I haven't really used it in Visual Studio Code, but there's other ways to debug even in the browser. All it does is it stops that execution on that line of code, so you can evaluate what the variable definition or the variable values are at that point. We can take a closer look at that later if we want to, but I don't want to throw too much at you just in this moment here. So we create this use context store. That's just going to return our consumer, which gets us our value, which is this initial state. An object with 3 properties on it. And then we have a reducer, so we can decide when we dispatch an action to the store, what should happen. So we'll switch on the action type. It'll either be update brand, update inventory link, or load inventory. Everything else, don't do anything. Just return state as it is. Nothing's changing. Nothing to look at here. Nothing to see. All right. And then we export our provider, right? Our byte context.provider, because that comes from this context object that we set up. And this function, similar to this one, we have use state here and some sort of thing to change the state. Here, we're calling use reducer, which gives us both the state and the function to dispatch. Here's our value that we give to our provider. So now we have access to the state, and we have access to the function to send those actions to change the state. And we just pass it right into here. Yeah, all I'm doing is, oh, I put it down here probably for clarity. So we could just even simplify this, right? This is our value. That's it, just this thing. And then, of course, our children, so we can render stuff in this component tree. So to utilize this, we'll come back over here. Instead of theme provider, oh, we can still use theme provider. This will actually be, this is totally fine. You can actually have different contexts. You can access the different contexts. It can be nested and stuff, but maybe we'll just take it out just so it doesn't look confusing. So we'll import our, what do we call it, context store. Stores, context store. We'll wrap our header again. Right, so now header's the only thing that's getting this data or has access to this data. We're not going to use theme context anymore. What do we have in our values here? We have brand and inventory link. So we'll come back over here. We'll set these back to how they were. back to the dark side. And then our brand is going to come from that provider or that consumer. And there's a lot of stuff up here. Let me comment this out so we know we're not looking at something that's not valid right now. So we'll import use, I think it's use context store, from stores, context store, right? Use context store. Now we can say, we'll say, I think we did store equals use context store. So this store is the, well, we'll call it value. That's our provider value. And what were the two properties on value? App state and dispatch. So app state is an object. It looks like this, right? Because we gave that to our use reducer. And that gave us back our state. Now we can come down to the span, which, oh, it's right here. And that is value.appstate.brand. This app state's the object, brand was that property on that object. Let's make sure everything's working. Initial brand, is that what it was? I hope so. That's what it is now. There we go. So we'll just do byte in capital letters. So we can see our data coming in. We're consuming it. We're putting it into our UI. Now, this isn't going to work anymore, obviously. Instead, let's dispatch an action to update the brand. So on click, we'll call this update brand, so we know what we're doing. And this is now value.dispatch. We want to dispatch an action. So the first thing is we give it a type of update brand. And the next thing, payload, what should we call it now? Hummus. 2 M's, right? I think it's 2 M's. Good enough. So I click update brand. Now it says hummus. And it's even the color of the hummus from last night. Perfect. Roasted red pepper hummus app. Okay. So the key difference between this context and this context as a store was that instead of using use state in the simple toggle function, we're using use reducer with that reducer pattern, right? So we're going to dispatch actions that have types and payloads and so on and so forth. That's the only difference between these two things, right? It was either use state or use reducer. Context will still send the value of that provider all the way down the tree. You can still consume it. It's just how you want to consume it and what type of data you want to affect your changes in and read from. That's up to you, right? So depending on what type of data that needs to flow down your application tree is whether you use state or use reducer or some other pattern. Or you could just have use context with just like one value on it, and that's it. That's all it's used for, which seems like that wouldn't be useful. But imagine that your component tree is 20 levels deep, and you want that theme to be passed into every single component. Rather than pass it down as props, you can set that theme once in context. And in every single component down the tree, you can import it where you need it. You don't have to pass it down as props anymore. Import it where you need it. That's what context, that's where it shines. You can skip entire tree structures. As long as it's somewhere down in the parent to child relationship, it'll work. It's like that back door that where you can go in, you can get into the theater for free. Any questions on this? Makes sense? Makes sense right now? Yeah. More valid question. So in 5 minutes, we're gonna take a quick break. Are there any things related to state, any burning questions related to state so far? Not just context. Or anything that you may have read or that you'd want to see in relation to any of this stuff, or any other React stuff, or JavaScript stuff. All right, so we'll take a break now. We'll take it 5 minutes early, and then you can go get your pictures. All right, so we'll be back. All right, so we're gonna get started again. And for the remainder of today, what we'll do is whoever's willing to talk about their project, we'll try to map out a basic structure of what a state management solution could look like for that particular project. Right, so who wants to go first? Kier, okay. All right, so the way I'm gonna do this is, what's this? Okay. I'm gonna pull open VS Code. And I'm just gonna create a folder. Not in source, we'll keep it in client. Let's call it students. Right? Oh wait, how do you spell? Is that right? Okay. Yeah, I don't know why I blanked. Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to map out a basic structure, right? So it'll be like pseudocode. So you can, that way, if something doesn't like function properly or something, we don't want to, just sit there and debug all night. Just as like a general, like, hey, here's the structure of your application. If you're going to use state management, what are the possibilities, right? So we'll start at, we'll just pretend that this is any component that I write. We'll just pretend we're importing it. It's a separate component. Okay, it'll make more sense once I start typing it out. So we'll start with your app. So so you were doing like a galleries sort of thing, right? So what's the topmost element in your particular application? Or what are the top level elements, I should say?
You mean like the component that
Yeah, so let's pretend that you've got this.
I have the main app component.
Okay.
Then I have a welcome page. Then I have featured art. Then I have the gallery. Then I have the artist bio.
So you have a landing page, right? The home page, you said?
Yeah, the welcome page is like
Welcome. So you have a welcome page. Then you have
featured art.
featured artist.
No, it's just like featured art. Okay,
Oh, featured art. You said a gallery?
a gallery. An artist page, artist bio, that kind of thing.
So this will be like this will be specific to, like if you're in a gallery, this would be specific to that particular artist.
Yep.
So I'll just put it here. We'll see how it makes sense to rearrange things.
And then lastly, so request forms. that have
Request.
art name.
Gotcha. Okay. So these are the various elements of your application. So it sounds like welcome is its own thing. Featured art probably be its own thing, right? Gallery will have things, but the artist is related to both of these, right?
Which one's featured art?
So artist, because you should probably be able to get to the artist between two of these, right?
Or you can just reference. Yeah, like I think like.
And then there's request form for that particular artist.
Well, there's only one artist.
Oh, there's only one artist.
There's only one artist. So this is all his work.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I have just one page.
Gotcha. Okay, so this structure makes sense then. Okay, so the request form is almost like a contact page as well, right? Hey, I want to get in touch with you because I want you to make some art for me. Yeah. Okay. Not like, hey, let's go out for drinks, right? It's like, pay me, make me some art. Or yeah, I pay you, you make me some art.
I have a shopping cart component as well.
Shopping cart, okay. So these are all the elements here. So because of like this particular thing here, the shopping cart very specifically, use state or use reducer is probably going to be a little on the light side for you. Because you'll want to have a central place to like add to the cart, I'm assuming, right? You want to add something to the cart. That's why you have a shopping cart, right? So So something like that could be, you could even do something like this sort of structure. Right, so your shopping cart could wrap the components where it's valid. Like that sort of, you can even look at it like, or instead of that, you could say, here's your store. And then you have, oops.
So wouldn't it just wrap the gallery though? It's only got one artist.
Oh, sorry. Featured art. If you want to buy that featured art, probably want to add it to the cart.
So you have a store that has a featured art gallery at the shop
As children.
as children, and that's because
Well, the store would hold any, well, if you're going to add stuff to the cart, where are you going to add it from? Probably the gallery. Or featured art, maybe. Maybe not.
oh yeah, because they click it and then you
You want to have access to the store to dispatch something to the store to save it.
you're talking about
I'm just talking about state management.
in the store you're talking about is like the one that you showed us.
Yes,
Okay.
that's your provider.
I don't know. So, okay.
So I'll just do this,
I get that.
right? So that's your provider,
So we're talking content.
right?
Okay.
So you could definitely use that. So in your gallery, I'm just gonna right, and each one of these could have. Well, let me do this.
Oh, I didn't think of that.
Right, so inside your gallery, you have art. Right? Right, so for each art, there's a button to add to the cart.
Okay.
And then somewhere along the line, also inside the cart, you have your checkout. So this would be like a valid way to handle the state within your application. You put the store around only the parts that need it. In fact, what we'll do is we'll, this should be okay. Your store holds all the data, whether you're adding to the cart, deleting from the cart, or changing quantities, or whatever it happens to be, right? You probably don't need to worry about it for the welcome page, unless you want to display something like, hey, this is how much stuff's in your cart, but then you could also have an icon at the top, right? Oh, or you know what, even better. You could wrap the entire thing here. Right, and then you could have a link to your shopping cart that shows how many items are in there, like in a nav bar or something like that. Right, because usually when you go to a site where you have a shopping cart, it shows a little icon with like a number, like how many things are in my cart. So you could implement something like that if you wanted to, and then you would wrap your entire thing in the store, right? Because then on any page you could have that updated in the corner, right? And then inside your gallery you'd have your artwork. For each art component, you could have a button to add to the cart. Here's your shopping cart. Inside your shopping cart also has access, of course, to your state. You have a checkout button, right? And then you go through the process, fill out the form, make the payment, whatever it needs to do.
So right now, inside the gallery, I do a fetch, and then the data that I give from the fetch is like an array of pictures.
Mhm.
And then I do the mapping thing in order to generate the div that
Yep.
displays them. How can I do that with this kind of structure? Or I mean, not even, I don't have to do that, but I like the idea that every picture dynamically render.
Okay, so let's imagine that your store provides you with, so you make an API call. Let's just say it saves it into state as artwork, right? So you would say state dot, oops. Again, this is very loose. Oh, why are you doing this? Hold on. State dot artwork dot map. And so for each one of these, set up the structure here. Let me get rid of all but one of these. So you have your art, and then maybe the index that it's at. Or let's just pretend art is an object. It has different properties. It has like the ID in your database, the image associated with it, maybe some caption text, or the date it was created, or something like that, right? So this art variable represents that particular object in your array of data, right? So your art would have a key, and that'd be your art.id. Let's see if it has a unique identifier. You could also pass in maybe the name, right? And then maybe description. Right, so it would look like this. For each one of these, it's going to create an art component. It has its own button to add to cart. So that's how you would map over that. Right, so you get it from your state, and that would be the, like, let's say if you were to use context, you'd say, use, what would it be for you? It would be something like, you would import, use gallery context or something, or whatever you're going to call it, right? From your store or something, just as an example, right? Just to get we know what this is for, just type of thing. And then you'd say const gallery state dispatch equals use gallery context. This would be gallery state. So it would come from your state. Then you'd map over that particular artwork array. And then you generate an art component for each one of those things. That way they all don't have to live as like you're just hard coding these values in there. You could fill that array with whatever artwork you want, right? If you want to add a new one, it's easy to do that. Just dispatch an action up to your database, and you get a new one, and next time it renders, it's in the array, right? And then for updating that database, you could provide maybe like like, are you going to have like a login for this particular artist so they can log into their site, make changes, or add artwork? Or is it something you're going to manage for them? You're going to manage it for them? So what you could do is you could create a page just for you that has a form with all the fields that you'd want to add to your artwork array. Like the name of the art, the date it was created, a description for it, the price, the location of the image itself in your code, right? You submit the form to your database, it logs it in there, and then the next time your app loads, it fetches that artwork, and now it's part of that array, right? So you could totally do something like that. Just throw a password on it. Someone else can just add stuff in there willy-nilly, but so that would be one way to manage that. And that would be like a, let's say admin form or something, right? You could add that in there. So that only you know how to get to it. Or you can just access your database and enter some stuff in there too, however you want to do it. Whatever is easiest for you. It would probably down the road, they're going to want to manage it themselves at some point, most likely. So setting up that admin access would be beneficial. That way they don't have to call you up and say, hey, Dick here, can you add 3 more pieces of artwork? It's like, no, man, I gave you an admin thing. Just fill out the form, right? Like you don't have to worry about maintaining it for them. Right? Offload as much as you can the person that is going to be using it. That way you free up time to work on your next project for someone else. Right? Allow them to have access. So you have to figure that part out. All right. Does the structure make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'll do is today I'll just push these all to GitHub so that we don't lose it, or you don't have to rewatch just to find it. All right. Cool. Any other questions on this so far, or is this a good layout?
Good. Yeah,
Okay.
I wasn't thinking about like the site in that way, or you broke down components in the way that I didn't think of.
Yeah. So looking at it this way, even though these are just pretend, you can get a better idea of your structure. And what's cool about this is you can just open a file just like this and just be like, okay, I'm just gonna put this here. What if I move this over here? What if I move this? What order do I want them? What makes the most sense? Play with it first. That way, when it comes time to actually code it, you're like, I know components I need. I know where they're gonna be. I know what's gonna be a child of this other parent over here. I know where I need to wrap my store around. I know what components are gonna import that context, all of that stuff. So this is kind of like a wireframe before the wireframe. Right? We haven't drawn anything out. All we know is we have these pseudo components on our screen that we can visualize the depth of our application to. So as soon as you said, well, shopping cart and all that stuff, and it's like, well, now it changes, right? Now it's not this flat structure. Use state becomes really painful to use, right? Context becomes a lot easier because now you've got levels. Right? You're mapping over things that are going to have components inside them. You want to have access to that state easily, right? So that totally brought out the solution that you need. Cool. Anyone else? Okay.
Right, so I sent you something last night.
Yes, I saw that.
So I can talk through the pseudocode.
Sure. Let's create. Oh,
So I'm working on a trip planner. For people to be able to plan a bus trip. And so there's going to be a login. The nav bar would probably be first.
we'll just write it down first. Yeah, let's get them all out.
All right. And there's going to be a form, and the form has 2 parts to it. There's going to be get your current location, and then there's going to be a place where you can type in your destination, where you're trying to go, and then there's going to be a submit button, which will need to access the bus information database.
Yeah, folks, that'll be like an API call, or
Well, yes, because
you'll have to dispatch some sort of action, right?
Yeah.
So let's do this real quick. Just say. Okay.
right, and so
You have like a map.
so when the user hits the submit button, gonna have to build in some logic. So the first thing that needs to happen is my program needs to calculate the nearest stop to that person's location. And then my program needs to return to the user what that nearest stop is.
Okay.
And then but if they're already on the bus stop, then it's just gonna let them know they're already.
Then it'll be a real quick one.
Yeah. So.
We'll say
yeah,
this.
so
We'll
the
say
calculation, if the calculation of current location
Oops.
minus whatever the coordinates for the bus stop are, that 0, it's like you're already at the bus stop. I thought that was kind of.
So there we go.
And so if the nearest bus stop is greater than 0,
Oh.
I need my program to calculate the stop that is the least, I hope I'm saying this correctly, the least furthest away, and then return that to the user in miles. So, yeah.
So so you want to find the closest stop,
The
basically.
closest stop, right? And return that to the user in miles. So I know that with geolocation, you have to use, it's doing it in latitude and longitude.
Mhm.
So in the background, it would be returning the coordinates. So I need to take those coordinates and I need to use geolocation to return it as the actual intersection. And then the next thing that would happen is once they figure out what the nearest stop is, well, so the purpose of the nav bar is going to be for the user to try to locate the nearest stop or plan a trip. They'll be able to do one or the other. So what we've just done is locate the stop. So what I want to be able to do is to reuse this information for the stop to actually plan a trip if they want to plan a trip from that stop.
From the stop that they're at.
From the stop that, yes, from the stop that's going to be returned to them. So if the user is going to plan a trip and they have the stop information, whether they type it in or use current location, when they hit the submit button, then what will be returned to them is an actual map of the bus route, the bus that they should take. So all of this will be in the database. So it will be the bus information, a map of the bus route, and what time the bus will arrive at that corner. And I also want to set an alert for when the bus is within 5 miles.
An alert.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would be.
So I'm supposed to be using some type of real-time bus tracking, and I heard that Firebase is good to use for that. So, information display the map of the trip. When the map is displayed, I also want to show the beginning endpoint and the ending endpoint for the trip, like those little pins that they use to Uber.
Got I'm missing something here. Oops, that's right. And then this. Oh. Try and stop. I think I lost the structure here. So look, this is all within planet trip. From current stop. And this, what was the other one? The from current stop, and then also the generate of the map.
Yes. So, as a part of planning the trip, a map will be returned to the user. I guess it'll zoom in on whatever the trip is. It'll show the beginning destination and the ending destination. And
So your map is probably going to take up a big portion of the screen. Okay, so this would be, yeah, so this would be, let me put that back. Generate map, and then we also need the map itself. Okay.
So there's map information, bus route, and bus time information, and asking the user whether or not they would like and where the bus is within 5 miles. So I'm tapping into that real time tracking information.
Okay. So far we have this nav bar, which has a place to locate your stop or to plan a trip. You have a login. That'll probably be up in your nav bar or something. Now the plan a trip stuff, these would be, this could even be just a menu, right? This could be the generate map menu item. This could be the from current stop menu item. And those would just be ways to access that logic, right? You click that link, it accesses this logic up here, right? Eventually that gets some sort of map displayed, right? And there's also a form that you'd want to get on as well. Okay. So it sounds like map is going to need access to the return of all that stuff. Form will need to be able to submit it. These will be able to need to be able to submit it. So you would have you would wrap your store. You could wrap your store around the whole thing, whatever you're going to use. It could just be, you don't have like, I mean, there's a lot of data per se, because you have route data and map data and stuff like that. But the structure of the application is actually pretty flat, right? So you could get away with something like use reducer and just dispatch a few actions and just read from those actions. I don't think you absolutely need a full-blown like context store or anything like that. You could. You are going to be making some API calls, so you need to think about asynchronous things, right? But you can do that asynchronous thing, and the result of that dispatch the action, like we went over earlier. So the choice is up to you, is how complex you'd want to make that. But you could have, like this store could just be a component that just has that use reducer logic in it. And you could just pass the props down to the other things. Or you could use the context. Either way would be fine. Yeah. Does this structure help?
It does.
Okay, so. I'll just put a note. Anything else?
Yes, I know.
Okay. So you can compare this to how you've got your things set up now and see if it'll work for you.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Yep. See you later, Dakir. Anyone else? Okay.
So, mine is a cleaning app, so you first go to the homepage, and then you click either get help or give help. I can have it, in the right place. Then, you go to the create account login page.
Sorry, I wasn't typing as fast as you were talking. So you said you had like a header or a nav bar?
Yes. Header and a nav bar. The header would be for the logo.
So you have a header
And the nav bar.
and the nav bar. Okay.
Then there's the buttons. You get to this button.
And the nav bar.
No, these are in the, no, the nav bar is like stuff, like if you want to skip all that, like about us and the blog and things like
Okay, let's just put that in there. Just so they're there. Blog.
rates.
Contact stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you have these buttons.
Correct. So one is get help, one is give help. Either one of those takes you to a create account or a login page. And
Okay.
from there, they split between people who want to work and people who need help.
Okay, so you have a login page, then you have a page for the get help page
Right.
and give help page.
Yeah, if you go to the get help page, then you can pick one of the radio buttons.
Okay,
It would have like 6 different things you could choose that you need help with. If it's the give help page, then you can pick which one of those 6 things you're willing to do.
so these are basically just forms, right?
Correct.
Form, this has radio in it. We got a bunch of these. And the other page would be basically the same type of deal.
Correct.
Okay, so we'll do this. Just rename this to give. Just to keep the structure a little bit cleaner, we'll just do something like this just for now. We're going off the page.
And then you could also tell it on that page where you live.
Oh, okay, so
And I need help with walking my dog and I live in the wind. Then on the give help page, like I would walk dogs and I would go to the east side or do it. I'd go to do it or,
your services offered, right? That would be like probably above the form. This would be part of the form, right? Because you definitely want that there. Services offered is just like a disclaimer. And then you choose.
Right.
Okay.
And then the person who needs help would get like 3 choices of people that were willing to come.
Oh, so you could choose.
Yeah,
So
well,
this
it
would
would
be-
be like 3 names, so you could call that person and arrange a time.
So a list of helpers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then then it would be like, do you accept this? Yes, and then it would, I'm not setting up a payment page, but theoretically it would go to a payment page.
Okay. So this is your disclaimer. Right, are you sure?
Right.
Yep.
Do you accept this offer?
Right.
Okay. Not so clear.
Okay. So these 2 pages are really similar. You could totally reuse a lot of code. But the basic idea, you could literally, I mean, they are going to be different forms with different content,
Right.
So you could just like finish one page, copy, paste it, and just change the info,
Correct.
right? It'll save you a lot of time that way. All right. Is that the basis of it, or are there any other pages that are going to display?
No, that's pretty much it.
Okay. So your forms are going to be submitting. Some sort of form submission logic. So these two are going to need access to, and then you're storing this stuff, you're storing all this information in a database?
Yeah.
Okay. So you'll need to do some fetches, do some API calls. So you'll need a way to do that. You do have a login page.
Mhm.
So you'll definitely have, you'll need to know who they are. The login page needs access to that.
Mhm.
So wherever the state of this application will live will have to be above login page. And since login page is kind of at the same level of the other ones,
Mhm.
you could have your store wraps the whole thing,
Okay.
right? And the same, because also like Dana's, it's fairly flat structure. You could get away with either use reducer or context. Yep, it would be, I would say it's your choice, right? To how complex you want to make that solution. A little bit more than just use state. Yep. But dispatching actions with types to know exactly what's going on would probably help. Whether it's just using use reducer at a top level component, pass down a couple props, or use the context to just bypass all the props. I'd say either one's perfectly valid. So I will put the same note at the top. There we go. Does this, looking at the structure, does that help?
Mhm.
Okay. Anyone else? Or I'm sorry, do you have any other questions on this?
You ready?
You say it like, am I ready?
I don't know, are you?
Sure. What you got? Bring it on.
Alrighty, we did discuss the other day about, having my login page be separate from the actual app.
Yes, because you wanted it. Yep. So this would be for simplicity's sake. You would just render your application in a div on those particular pages, right? So you have your login page or a page, right? And then you'll have your actual app. Login page app. Doesn't like it because I have two HTML documents in the same thing, but that's okay. This is just pretend.
So once like they've created their account and they're logged in, the first thing they'll see is either the new round or previous round.
Round. Okay, so we've got, what would we call that? So,
I mean, essentially, there's just two icons with two buttons.
okay, so you've got, is it current round?
Yeah, new round. and
Oh,
previous.
button. All right. Okay. So we've got, let's do this. And what was the other one?
Previous.
Previous.
go, so for a new round, it'll go to, they're gonna select however many targets.
So either way, they're going to be taken to targets. Because these are just buttons.
They are, the previous round though will go to their finished. It'll be a finished table with a date of the rounds.
Let's keep these separate like this. So this would be a table.
Yep.
With rounds.
Completed, or for them to say that they're done completing, they're not done finishing.
Got it. We'll just do this for simplicity's sake. So you've got some rounds that go into the table. Okay.
So once they choose the number of targets, that's when it creates the table with however many targets they chose. They chose 30 targets.
For a new round.
Yep.
So inside our targets, we have a way to, what was it again?
It's gonna go to the table that's gonna either start with.
Oh, these are like, if I remember correctly, these are like separate pages as you navigate through it, right?
Yeah.
So we'll keep that as a separate component. And then this is what you choose the course or something.
So you're gonna hit new round.
Mhm.
That's gonna take you to how many ever targets you're gonna choose. A number, custom number doesn't matter. So we'll say 30 targets.
So your target choice page.
Yep. From there, once you've chosen your target choice, it's gonna bring up like a table or at least a row starting with like number 1, because you're gonna start at target number 1.
Oh, okay. So you have a table. We'll just say data for now.
Yep.
Okay.
So they click on that and that takes them to the page where they're going to record their score. I'm gonna drop a pin. There's a button for previous target, next target.
Let's. Can't type. Okay.
There's a button for recording the score. The button to add notes. And after each, so for each one that they do, there will be a button to just confirm that so that it changes at the top. It's just going to be a static box to increase or decrease the target number, depending on which button they hit. Next target or previous target.
And that shows at the top of the whole
Yeah.
app,
Nope, it's gonna at the top of the score recorder.
the score recorder.
Yeah.
This was going to be.
It's just a static box, one with the target number that will increase as they each time they hit next,
Oh, okay.
and then just like the username.
Okay.
Once they get through all their targets, the next button goes to finish, and it takes them back to the table.
So eventually a finish button will show up.
Yes.
Once at the end of the round or whatever.
Yep.
Okay. Say equals true or false. Okay, and then that takes you
to the table, and then they look
back to the table.
Yep, they look over the information and they confirm it, and it'll say, you want to save this round, delete it, whatever.
You have that choice.
Because everything else is up in the nav bar
Gotcha.
with the profiler.
So you have a nav bar.
Yep.
Okay. Yours is also pretty flat, right? So the structure is not really too deep. I mean, you have a lot going on in here.
Mhm.
But score recorder could have its own, almost like its own mini state. It'll hold all that information until it's ready to be sent back up to the whole app, right? So you could have two different areas of state. This score recorder could have its own, and then we'll just say has own state. And you could totally use like use state for that, right? So all you're doing is recording bits and pieces of state. Or just a simple, like you could use reducer in here,
Mhm.
but it's only valid inside here, right? Because that's all that it cares about. But the confirm or the finish could send it up to some other piece of state. Or you could just, again, you could wrap the whole thing in a use reducer or a context and get away with that too. Right, so in fact,
But I am gonna incorporate the two pages together like we talked about the other day.
yeah. So I think because of the complexity of the data, because you're going to have rows of things and they're going through all these targets and everything, you might want to lean more towards like context or like that state management component, just to keep it clean and organized. I'd probably do that. You could say the store, probably definitely want to implement some sort of store that just wraps your whole app. That will make your life easier managing this stuff. Because then at any point in your application, you have access to it. And then you could dispatch specific actions to update only those things.
Yeah.
And eventually you're going to need to forward this on to the database too.
Right.
Right, so they can record it because they're logging in, they're getting their data. That quick store would probably be really good for you, because you can do all that asynchronous reducer stuff right there, right? It's all located in one file because you're going to be doing quite a bit of this stuff, right? So in our one-on-one, I can show you some extra things to keep it even more organized.
Okay. Yeah. that would be good. And that's what I was thinking when you got all done yesterday. And I thought, that's not what I'm going to use, just because. I mean,
The complexity of your data
right.
requires a very organized approach.
Yep. And
Yep.
and I knew that. I knew it wasn't so much how it was laid out. It was more the complexity of all the data that I had.
Yeah, yeah. That would
I
be
mean, I'm okay with it because I want it to be right.
like something in here. It doesn't like the HTML. That's what it doesn't like. But yeah, we can totally go over.
Just comment it out. Can't you just comment, like, a comment? So then I can say, actually, just like.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Oh, you know what? I didn't realize this. That's why. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we can make that work for you. Yep. Cool.
I knew my data was going to be right.
Your app really is just data with a couple visuals. That's all it is, right? So yeah, you'll need a nice organized approach to it. Definitely. Are you good with this so far?
Yeah, no, that's good
Okay.
for me.
I mean, you have a lot of your stuff already like mocked out and everything. So
Well, yeah, now I still have a couple of pages for the front end to change over, but we.
are you already using router?
No.
No.
That's one of the other things that I was gonna go over.
Yeah, so I would put in here the router.
Because I'm definitely gonna need one. That's,
Yeah, you've got your jumping around in pages and stuff, and
Yeah.
you could wrap the store around the router, and you have this like kind of how Byte is set up, really, except with more routes.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's definitely gonna be a lot. And then when I ask, other, like when I ask a couple of guys, well, I'd like to be able to do this. Okay, well, let's put that in there. Like,
Right.
just the one guy with flipping the image. I was like, I'm thinking about it and I'm like, okay, and then I thought, well, that's really not gonna change too much other than what it looks like because they're recording their score.
Right.
If it was, the pin drop was recording the score, and then I'd have.
Then it'd be,
I'd be in, that would be a world of.
that's back burner. That's back burner
It
mode.
is,
Yeah.
it is. Extreme back burner mode, because that changes all the logic once you flip, like you, yeah, I'm not.
Yep.
Not right now. That can go. I have notes for what I want to do after we finish and I keep.
Right. But you have a lot of your structure already in place, right? Already,
All
right?
my front end is done in my.
Yeah.
database.
All we have to do is plug in those components that you'll need, and then we can just wire them up.
Yeah, 'cause the back end is. My database is, I don't have anything in it.
But it's there.
It's there. I mean, you could go to like and see my table and stuff.
Cool. Very cool. All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
And then, just let me, let me.
I'll let you know. Probably like 4:30.
It's not an issue for me, whatever works for boss.
I realized during the break, I'm photographing a wedding on Saturday. That's why I'm not available. It's a good thing I remembered though. Otherwise, I'd be wondering where I was.
That would be a bad thing.
That would be a bit-
Not good for business. All right. So,
Thanks, Joey.
I can send you this. I typed it out for you.
oh, okay. Oh, you've already done it here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the same as like what you're doing, but like
Right.
essentially, what I don't always get to I wish break it up.
Gotcha. So you have component that we use to fetch data from the database. Okay.
And there's
And then,
several things that are going to need access that, so I'm essentially just going to restyle that container for whatever purpose it's showing.
gotcha. Okay. So you just reuse it.
Yeah,
Yep.
because my app is gonna need it for the results display. My user is gonna need it when they log in and they see their account with the matching dots, and then the shelter will need it when they log in and see what dots they get in their.
Okay.
So that's, I'm just not sure exactly where to put it. Like how it's.
Let's see. So you have, I mean, each one of those kind of is its own. You are reusing it, but
Right, and I think if I understand everything correctly, I can use my dog container to do all of the fetching to my database.
right. So all your fetches can happen in one location.
But those fetches are going to rely on, like, say a user matches with type A, it's gonna fetch type A data.
hmm
So I don't know if that throws a wrench into things or.
So really what you have are, so let's look at it from the user's point of view. So that says results to return dog matches. So they're going to submit some sort of form.
Right, they take
Right.
the quiz and they
Okay.
get back a match.
They get back a match. Okay, so, and essentially this quiz is really just a form that they're filling out, right? They're going to select some options. They're going to submit it. It's going to make a call to the database. You're going to get a result and show a page with your results, right? So those are two separate pages. So having that router will help you to route between the two. I wouldn't necessarily just render them conditionally, like if this is true, render this, if not, render that. Just because you have several like types of quizzes or something going on here, the router would definitely help you. so you can navigate to these things easily. Yeah, so your submit button on the form would have, it'll send off that action to do the
Right, what
the
happens
post.
right now is, so you go through 10 questions, and there's not even a submit form, just based on like when you get to question 10, it knows that's the last one.
Oh, okay,
So it just says, okay, that's the end of that, and then it renders the results.
gotcha.
Just like automatically. So like if there's a
Oh,
question
okay.
left, it renders another question. If there's no questions left, it renders results. There's that if or statement.
Gotcha. Okay, so
Should I structure
here's what you could do. As it's going through this quiz,
it? Mhm.
every time they select whatever option they're selecting, that's writing into state.
Which
It's
I
recording.
believe it already does.
Yep.
It goes into an array that's either A, B, or C. And it adds.
So then the last button that you click that shows the results,
Mhm.
that's one of those links that links to a new route. And when that route renders, it goes and fetches the results for you.
Okay, so
Right.
I should add a submit button to my quiz.
It doesn't have to say submit, but that last button that takes you to the results,
Mhm.
kind of what it is, right? Submitting these options. You could route to a results page, and that results page, when it loads, remember how we have that use effect?
Mhm.
The component did mount. That will make a call that does two things. It takes whatever's in your state, goes, gets your matches, brings back the results, and then displays that. Right, that all happens when that page loads. Takes the state, sends it back, brings back the results, and it displays. So that's one option that you could do. That way, that button's it's just a simple link. That's all it's doing. It's just a link to a results page. That results page knows what it needs to do. It needs to take stuff that's in state, find some matches, and just bring it back to display it. That would be the simplest way to do it, the least time-intensive way.
I see that now, but
The other thing you could do is that submit button could actually do the call out, and then part of the logic before it returns is to redirect you to the new page to display the results. That's the other way to go about it, because you can programmatically redirect using React Router.
and it's okay to have everything in that one router page, like it's.
Sure. Yeah, as long as it visually makes sense. Yep.
And again, my document doesn't throw any weird things with state because I'm using it in different places.
You're using it in a different place, so it should only be accessing certain pieces of state. If it's accessing state at all.
Mm.
Right, so this can be used to fetch dog data from the database. So really, it sounds like your dog container wraps around the whole thing
Okay.
in a sense, because it's the one going to get the initial data
Right.
that the rest of your app's going to need.
Right.
So your dog container is almost like your store. Most of your application, like your fetching of data, can just happen in that component did mount phase for each of your pages. It's almost like the state that you have. It sounds like all of the state that you would need to display is just coming back from your database anyways.
Right.
Right, so you could just utilize simple type of state management stuff. Maybe just pass down a couple props if you need to. But it sounds like you could just, as soon as this page loads it on that use effect, or if you do a class component did mount, do the fetch, bring back the results, and just display them on the page, right? Well, you would use something like a use state. So you'd fetch it, in the return you'd set the state, and then it'll display once it comes back. That whole use state thing would totally work fine. You could just have one for each particular part of the app for the shelter, the user, or whatever. That's really not, it's not that complex.
No, I
You
think I start thinking one way and then I think another way and then I think I'm wrong.
Yeah.
One way and then I'm like, oh.
You could really, it could be a really simple solution. Yep. Does that help?
Yeah.
And if you need some more help on that, just shoot me a message, or I'm going to be here next week on Tuesday. So you can definitely hit me up for that if you're struggling with it. Or like I said, just send me a message if you need to.
And right now, technically, I don't have anything in the database. Like,
Okay. So it's not there yet.
No.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, but yours could be a really simple solution. It wouldn't be that complex at all. You could do a lot with it. All right, anything else with it? Is it good for now?
no, I'm good.
Okay, so hopefully that helps. I know it's kind of vague on some of that, but you have your structure already here, and it just looks like you just need some different routes that just handle the state when the thing loads. Quite. Okay.
So I figure I'd like follow like a sample like throughout its sort of life cycle, and just start with like the sampler goes and gets a sample of maybe it's like I don't know, we're gonna look for lead in some soil or something, and they get the sample and the sample sample taken. And all the information that needs to go with that sample goes along to the next step, where it is sample received.
Oh, okay. So this is where they're. Okay,
I guess
so
that's just like data that the sample object would.
right. So you're sending along this object that has all these properties about the sample. Okay.
And oh yeah.
So this is like a tracker?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I wanted to start with like the sample, the sampler, and the sample received, just to make sure I could like get the information between those two.
Right.
After that, I guess basic like user interface is pretty much the same. Everybody has to like review data, add new data for something, and then pass that along to the next person. So I guess like the app's like goals are sort of at the bottom there.
Okay. So just as a quick glance, it looks like your app is just a series of forms that people are going to fill out to track the life cycle of this sample, right? Like, what is this sample? What does it do? On to the next person. They maybe review it, right? That's the impression I'm getting. So yeah, I mean, this is a pretty simple state management solution. Each thing's a form that just sends that stuff to state. Next page loads, like maybe a router, you route through the pages. Each one of those submits as a link, just like with hers. And yeah, you're just sending the data back to. It doesn't even have to be. Now, is this going to be eventually stored in a database, or is it stored in the database after every form submission?
So at each level, like data needs to be put somewhere else.
Okay, just for permanence,
Yeah.
right? So in case you got to reload the app, or right, if someone else picks it up on another screen or something. Okay, yep.
Right.
So
like the manager could be sitting at their desk and they would get like, I don't know, an alert saying the sampler tipped the sample.
right, gotcha. So you could structure it so that each one of these views is just a route, And then each route is really just a form. And on your form submission, it just does an asynchronous call up to your database with the data.
Yeah.
Right? And then you could just redirect to the next page immediately, or they could come back to it later, it sounds like. Like you could even get, I mean, you would need a way to pull that data down if someone's logging in for the somewhere else and grabbing the data.
Well, I was just gonna try to keep it
Just real
like,
simple for now.
super duper simple.
So this is like proof of concept simple.
Right, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, so yeah, so for that, yeah, you would just take like a router, make some routes, and then each route, like I said, would just be a form that just submits to the database and then just redirects you to the next page.
Yeah.
And that would be your proof of concept.
Yeah.
That would be real simple. You don't even, other than sending the data to the database, the only other state you'd need would just be to hold it there temporarily till the next view can pick it up. You could use,
Like I sort of wanted like a progress bar that like everybody at every level could see.
oh, okay, yeah.
Like,
So you'd
oh,
want to store that at, like, you'd want to wrap your whole application in some sort of state management solution, right? Not just each step. For something like that, either like a use reducer or context type of solution on the simple side. And then kind of like what we were doing in Byte for the context store would be on the more complex side. Your application's pretty flatly structured too. So
like the sample starts, it goes forward in time, and then it ends.
yeah,
It
I mean,
cannot go backwards. Well, yeah.
you'd have your choice between use state and use reducer to keep it real simple. Do your asynchronous fetch to post your data. And then when that gets back, dispatch the action to record it in state, move on. Yeah, keep it simple. Yep. I wouldn't even bother going to the higher end with that, just because it doesn't need it. Yeah, any flatly structured app like that could easily get away with like a use reducer, right? Just make sure you dispatch after your fetch is done, right? Because then you can dispatch once you get the result back that it was successful, right? So post to the database, return like a 1 or a 0. 1 could be it was successful, 0 was it wasn't. If 1, then dispatch action, and that just takes you to the next page and records your stuff in state, and then it could display. And then you can update your status bar, right? Yep. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. That would be the simplest way to approach that, I would think. Just keep it simple.
I mean, if I have time, like, you know, I could take it to the next level with like the test and the analyst.
Yeah,
But like,
but since it's only 2 views, if you eventually want to grow, I would say if it was only ever going to be 2 views, you could just conditionally render those views. But since you want to add to it, I would invest in the router setup. Because if you want to add to it, like conditionally rendering all these things gets kind of tedious.
right.
I've done that before. It gets
Thinking
tedious.
about like tying it to like the user, right? So like the sampler only needs to see a certain set of data. The sample receive person only needs to see a certain set of data.
Oh, so depending on which view would be which data you show,
Right.
right?
And the person at the end can see like a summation of all that stuff, but they're not necessarily adding new data. They're just adding like, I don't know, context or something.
Some final comments.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just see this as a series of forms. Yeah. Yeah, you can make this pretty simple. Are you in a good state to
Yeah, I think with
do
like
that?
everything that we've done so far and the way this is structured, I think that's good.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions? You can bounce it up on any of us. So, cool. Excellent. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty simple solution for you.
Yeah.
Let's see. Any other questions on setting any of that up, or are you good for tonight?
Well, I guess I just need to make sure it works with like the smallest piece of data possible.
Right, yeah.
And then see what else can happen.
First, yeah, make a way for a user to fill out a form
Right.
and submit it to a database. Make sure that works.
Yeah.
And then once you see it in the database, you could say, okay, how do I now move them to the next page? Just get this page done first.
Yeah.
Because it's just going to be a succession of pages.
Right.
So once you figure out that first pattern, you're good to go on the rest. Now it's just a matter of, okay, well, what does this page show? Yep. So yeah, if you can fill out a form and send it to the database and see a result and record some stuff in some sort of state, figuring out how to move it to another page is trivial at that point. So I would say take that one step at a time.
Right. For sure.
All right, cool.
Very cool.
All right. Any other questions? We've got about 15 minutes. Everyone's kind of like ducked out. I was hoping more people would stay at the end because I wanted to, before everyone started leaving after the thing. For tomorrow, I was going to either give the option of kind of leaving it open to whatever we wanted to discuss over the past 2 weeks, or I could show a demonstration on how to create, how to use Webpack from scratch. So when you type create React app and give it the name, it creates a solution for you. Under the hood, it's doing all this Webpack configuration to kind of like make it so that we can, every time we type npm start, our thing loads up, it's all there. It's doing all that for you. That build process is being handled by a tool called Webpack. So I was going to give the option if anyone wanted to see how you would create one of those without create React app. There's not a ton that goes into it just to make it happen, but you can definitely make it as crazy as you want. Or you can keep it really simple and just do this without any extra frills. So I was going to kind of leave it open. I can just kind of query everyone at the start of class. I could do it right now. Like I have the stuff all in my head. I could just write it out right now. But or we could just keep it open to questions about capstones and what we've gone over so far, and any more discussions on any of the structures of this app or state management, so on and so forth. So I guess I'll leave it up to everyone tomorrow to decide what we want to do.
And I don't have any questions right now.
Okay. All right, so are we good for tonight then? For the stream? Okay, so we will see everyone tomorrow.